Good morning, and welcome to the 38th Annual Frank Church Conference on Democracy on the Brink, The View from the Mountain West, sponsored by the Frank Church Institute at Boise State University. My name is Gary Wensky, and I am the Executive Director of the Frank Church Institute in the School of Public Service. The Institute was established to honor the achievements and to carry forward the principles of Senator Frank Church. He delivered the first lecture at Boise State University in 1982. Given today's challenges to democracies around the world, conversations like today's are even more important. On behalf of the Frank Church Institute Board of Directors, our thanks to Oppenheimer Companies, Evoca TV, Idaho Power Company, Andrew Scoggin, and Michael Pug Osling for sponsoring today's conference. To open the conference, please welcome Dr. Marlene Trump, President of Boise State University. A native of Wyoming and first-generation college student, Dr. Trump previously served as Provost and Executive Vice Chancellor of the University of California at Santa Cruz. Dr. Trump.
Welcome to the 38th Annual Frank Church Conference, held virtually from Boise State University. Last week, I had the privilege to moderate a democracy series for Congress to Campus on why Congress matters, featuring several former congressmen. This can be found on the Frank Church Institute website. This year's theme is Democracy on the Brink, the View from the Mountain West. The conference is part of a series based on the Frank Church Institute's strategic plan on how democracies survive and thrive in the 21st century. The conference will focus on a survey of 5 Intermountain states, Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, Utah, and Nevada, and on current democracy issues. The survey of 2,000 respondents was conducted by the national polling firm Morning Consult and sponsored by the Frank Church Institute in collaboration with the Idaho Policy Institute. The survey will be the subject of continuing FCI discussions on the democracy theme. The conference will include 2 panels. The morning panel will focus on the Mountain West and will be moderated by Peter Fenn, FCI board member and founder of Fenn Communications in Washington, D.C. The afternoon panel on Idaho will be moderated by Vanessa Fry, director of the Idaho Policy Institute at Boise State. You're in for a real treat with this year's keynote speaker, Celinda Lake, a Montana native, national pollster, and political strategist for President Biden and scores of other candidates and national organizations. I want to especially thank the FCI Executive Director, Gary Wensky, and President Skip Oppenheimer, as well as the entire Frank Church Institute Board of Directors, whose commitment of time and resources made today's conference possible. I hope you'll enjoy this wonderful event.
Thank you, Dr. Trump. The focus of this year's conference is a major survey underwritten by the Frank Church Institute in collaboration with the Idaho Policy Institute of some 1,900 residents of Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, Utah, and Nevada on democracy issues. The survey, done by the respected firm Morning Consult based in Washington, D.C., will be the focus of the discussion. This morning's panel will address the topic, The View from the Mountain West, moderated by Peter Fenn, founder of Fenn Communications in Washington, D.C. Previously, he served as Chief of Staff for Senator Church, co-founder of the Center for Responsive Politics, and surrogate spokesman for several presidential campaigns. Peter was also a longtime co-host of a political commentary show on MSNBC television. He serves on the boards of both the Frank Church and the Robert Dole Institutes. Joining him on the panel is Bill Fish, former managing director of Aladdin Capital Management, Dresdner Kleinwort, and Citigroup in London. He served on the staff of Senator Church and is a member of the Frank Church Institute Board of Directors. The third panelist is Jennifer Macdonald, Senior Director of Morning Consult, a leading research firm in Washington, D.C., that conducted the survey of the Mountain West. She will present the survey results. Let's begin with Peter Fenn.
Thanks very much, Gary. It's really a pleasure for us all to be here today. And I just want to give a heartfelt thanks to Jen Macdonald and to the whole operation at Morning Consult. They have been absolutely terrific to work with, and we have just an extraordinary collection of results here to talk about today. We're just touching the surface here. We're going to continue this process in the weeks and months ahead and delve even further into the data. But I'm just really pleased also to be joined by my colleague and my buddy, Bill Fish. We worked together in Senator Church's office. And of course, he went on to much better things than I, but we'll try to make sense of a lot of this data. But I think now I'll turn it over to Jen, and she'll give us the approach that they took and what they found. And we're going to kind of put this into 4 segments. So she'll start with the very first segment right now.
Great. Thank you so much for that introduction. As mentioned, my name is Jen, and I have the pleasure of walking you through some of the data that we collected with Frank Church Institute today. But before we begin, just a quick overview of Morning Consult. For those of you who are not familiar, Morning Consult is a global data intelligence company delivering insights on what people think in real time. We've been able to help executives at associations and nonprofits, universities, and companies collect, organize, and share credible data in real time through our scale, data quality, and speed. When it comes to scale, we're doing approximately 20,000 interviews per day across the 15 biggest economies globally, and that list is ever expanding. Our data quality and sample design is trusted by everyone from Frank Church Institute, the New York Times, all the way to the Federal Reserve. And our speed is unprecedented. When a crisis strikes or when a moment becomes opportune, we can come in and out of the field with a survey within 48 hours or less. So just a little bit of background on the poll. Gary and Dr. Trump all gave a very eloquent background, but just a little bit more before we begin. Morning Consult, on behalf of the Frank Church Institute, launched a poll in 5 states in the Mountain West: Idaho, Montana, Nevada, Utah, and Wyoming, to understand in these key states the perceived state of democracy, including health and concerns, and actionable solutions to help strengthen democracy. The poll was conducted between September 24th and October 26th among around 1,900 adults in these 5 states. The interviews were collected online, so all online polling, and the data was weighted to each individual state. Thinking about generally what we learned in this poll, the main themes that we found were that adults in these key states are concerned about the health of democracy in the United States. 85% of adults in these states say that they're concerned, with 50% saying that they are very concerned. And thinking about some of the core elements of a healthy democracy, we identified a couple of different concerns. One is the level and quality of representation that adults in these key states feel like they have at the federal, state, and local level. Another is the spread of misinformation or misrepresentation of facts on social media, the internet, and in the news. Another is the legitimacy of the last election and the last couple of elections generally, including the events that took place at the Capitol post-election. And then finally, that last concern that we identified and tested was the ability, or I guess the lack thereof, of Americans to find common ground with people who have different political opinions. So while adults in these key states express concern about these elements of democracy, they also have identified potential solutions to help strengthen the health of democracy. And these solutions focus on the broad need for reform as well as grassroots strategies. So the roadmap for the data today is really just going to be following those key findings. So I'm going to start with the health of democracy, and I'll be pausing periodically to allow the other panelists to add context and insights to the data. So finally, jumping into the data, starting with the health of democracy. One of the first questions that we asked was, thinking about the health of democracy in the US, which of the following best describes how you feel? And respondents were allowed to select up to 3 options out of the 15 that we presented to them. The most common response that we saw in terms of the health of democracy was concern. 50% of adults in these 5 states say that they feel concerned about the health of democracy. Other top responses all have these kind of negative connotations, like unsure, angry, sad, scared, and pessimistic. You do see hopeful, kind of wedged between a couple of other options with some negative connotations, so that was nice to see. But most of these top options really show that respondents are concerned. Next, we asked adults directly in these key states, how concerned are you, if at all, about the health of democracy in each of the following? The United States and your own state. And adults are more likely to say that they're concerned about the health of democracy at the national level than they are at the state level, their own state. 50% say that they are very concerned about the health of democracy in the United States. Even though people are more concerned about the health of democracy at the United States than at the state level, about 50%, a little over half, still say that they're concerned about the health of democracy in their own state. The gap that we're seeing, especially in intensity between concern at the federal level and the state level, is a pretty common theme that we'll see throughout the data today. It's also just generally a pretty common theme that we see in polling. The more local you get, the more trusted the entity is. So we'll regularly see people say, I have a favorable opinion of my own representative or my own school or my own bank, but then express some concern or hesitation or dissatisfaction with the education sector or the financial sector or Congress in general. So it's something that will keep coming up throughout the data findings today. So then moving into representation of government. And this was identified as one of kind of the specific concerns when we're thinking about the health of democracy. The first question that we asked was a matrix style question. We asked, how often, if ever, do you feel alienated from each of the options that you see listed on the left-hand side? So your federal government, your representatives in Congress, politics generally, your senators, your state government, your local government. I specifically want to call out the differences between federal, state, and local governments. Adults in the key states tested are more likely to say that they feel alienated from the federal government than they are to say that they feel alienated from your state or local government. Thinking through just some of the key demographics for this question, we really saw consistency around community types. So adults in urban, suburban, and rural areas all feel similarly. We also saw consistency across the individual states that we tested. So adults in all 5 states feel pretty similarly about alienation from each of the following options that we tested. But where we did see an interesting difference was looking at party ID. We saw higher levels of alienation at the federal level among Republicans compared to Democrats. So 80% of Republicans say that they feel alienated at the federal level compared to 68% of Democrats in these key states. Next, we asked, how much confidence do you have in each of the following, if any, to act in the best interest of the public? And again, we're seeing lower levels of confidence or trust in these more national governing bodies. So when we look at the presidency, about 35% say that they have a lot or some confidence in the president to act in the best interests of the public. 36% say that about the federal government. 31% say that about the US Congress. compared to something like the local government, where 61% of adults in these key states say that they feel confident that their local government does act in the best interest of the public. So we asked in the prior slide, generally, do you feel like the government acts in the best interest of the public? But we also wanted to make it a little bit more personal. So we followed up with, do you agree or disagree with each of the following statements? And the statement that we asked adults to agree or disagree with is, the federal government works to benefit other groups of people, but not people like me. And we tested the same statement at the state and local level. In keeping with the themes that we already saw today, adults in these key states are more likely to agree that government doesn't really benefit people like them at the federal level than they are at the state or local level. 59% say that they agree that the federal government works to benefit other types of people. But I will say that agreement is not low at the state or local levels, just lower than what we see at the federal level, which really indicates that adults just may feel more represented at the state or local level than they do the federal level. And when we break this question out by demographics, there are a couple that we thought were pretty interesting. Across parties, we see consistency with these state and local level statements. But we see higher levels of agreement among Republicans than Democrats at the federal level. So 65% of Republicans say that they agree that the federal government works to benefit other types of people, compared to 48% of Democrats who say the same. We also saw some interesting differences by community type, especially at the local level. At the local level, urban adults in these states, so adults living in urban areas versus suburban or rural, are actually slightly more likely than adults living in rural areas to agree that their local government works to benefit other people, but not people like them. So rural adults actually feel slightly more supported than urban adults at the local level in the 5 states tested. I'm going to pause here to allow the other 2 panelists to provide their insights on this data, but I'll come back on when we start talking about media and misinformation.
Thanks, Jen. That was terrific. And also, I want to encourage any of our viewers to submit questions in the chat, which we will make our best efforts to answer, to encourage a dialogue back and forth, as we do when we're in person with every one of the Frank Church conferences. I'll make a couple of comments and turn it to Bill. One of the things I think that not only this poll discovered, but other surveys nationally, is that in a very real sense, democracy is on life support. We're in trouble. This is not entirely new in the history of our country. When it was first started, it was the country was not sure it could survive. Certainly during the Civil War, we weren't sure it was going to survive. During periods of the Great Depression and the threat of World War II, and we weren't sure it was going to survive. So, this is a bit different because our basic institutions are being questioned, and instability is kind of the watchword here. And we'll discuss that in a little more detail as we move along. But one of the questions I had for Bill, and one of the things that we spent some time discussing, is, as someone who's been involved in the business world for so long, and at such a high level, what does this kind of instability do, Bill, with the business community?
Right. Well, businesses want stability and predictability so they can make plans. And in so much as our basic system of government isn't functioning, that's a pretty big risk. And that's why when the things like the debt limit come up and isn't even voted on, that creates a lot of anxiety. The reverse is true. When government is seen functioning, when the infrastructure bill, for example, is passed on a bipartisan basis, and there's a 10-year plan to improve our roads and our internet and our ports, that's a positive.
So in other words, the actual getting things done may lift some of these numbers up in the future. That's the great hope.
Yeah.
One of the things also that we sort of have to comment on is some of these numbers depend upon who's in charge, right? So when we're looking at the presidency or the government, the Republicans would tend to be a little bit more positive during the time when their person is president of the United States, previously Donald Trump, and Democrats feel a little bit differently. But I think the one thing, even though the state and local numbers are better than the federal government, one of the things that's still scary is those numbers still aren't very good. I mean, they used to be a whole lot better. And what we have seen over decades now is an increasing cynicism and alienation towards politics and government. And we need to turn that around. And it started really in the 60s, Vietnam, civil rights struggle, Watergate. People began to become cynical about government. And a lot of people campaigned against government. And one of the things that in order to get things back on track, we'll have to change that attitude.
Right. And it's important as we, and we'll talk about more of this later, but as we think about repairing democracy and strengthening democracy, given these numbers, we probably want to spend some time thinking about local and state elections, how to make sure they're fair and transparent, and give people more confidence in local and state governments, because trying to fix the federal government overnight is probably a challenge, but starting with in your own town, in your own county, in your own state is probably where we want to focus in terms of improving the situation.
The very famous old Speaker of the House, Tip O'Neill, probably said it best. He said, all politics is local. And as you pointed out with the infrastructure bill, it's going to be very local when bridges get built, when clean water is provided, and when people spend time and effort and real resources to boost local government, schools, broadband, there's a lot there to take care of. Why don't we, in the interest of time, and we'll come back to some of these topics, but why don't we turn it back to Jen, and she can talk a little bit about the media and misinformation and some of the problems that we face with that.
Absolutely. So media and misinformation, another area that our adults are particularly worried about in these 5 states. When we ask directly, how worried are you? And we ask them to test specifically misrepresentation of facts and misinformation, we learned that strong majorities in all 5 key states tested are worried about misrepresentation of facts. 56% say that they are very worried about misrepresentation of facts. 54% say that they are very worried about misinformation. And this is an area where we see both Republicans and Democrats in agreement, at least at the top line level. Republicans are just as likely as Democrats to say that they are worried both about misinformation and misrepresentation of facts. Just one caveat here from my perspective is that everyone is concerned about these things, but of course, everyone's definition of what these things are a little bit different. We didn't offer a definition for respondents, except to say that it's false or inaccurate information, so very broad. So the worry that we're seeing here is about each person's own interpretation of what misinformation and misrepresentation of facts means. We did actually find a relationship between misinformation and the health of democracy. In a matrix-style question that we launched at the start of the poll, we asked how concerning the spread of misinformation is to the health of democracy. And 87% of adults said that it was very or somewhat concerning. So it's not just that adults are worried, they're actually worried about the impact that it has on democracy. And then finally, in so many words, we asked who's responsible for the spread of misinformation or misrepresentation of facts. The question that we asked was, how much misinformation or misrepresentation of facts do you believe are spread on each of the following platforms? We tested social media, internet sources, and news media. Majorities of adults in the 5 states surveyed say that a lot of misinformation is spread on social media and on internet sources. And we see consensus across parties for that. So both Democrats and Republicans believe that a lot of misinformation is spread on these 2 platforms. We do see differences between parties when it comes to news media. So Republicans at 60% are more likely than Democrats at 26% to say that there is a lot of misinformation spread on news media. So I'm going to pause here again and turn it back over to the other panelists.
Thanks, Jen. Yeah, there's a lot underlying this data, and we'll release a lot more about it and talk a lot more about it in the future. But one of the things that's very clear for those of us with gray hair is that we're not in the Walter Cronkite era anymore. We're not even in the Brian Williams era anymore. The whole problem of lack of a trusted news sources has permeated our society. As Jen points out, especially for the national news media, Republicans are a lot more skeptical about this, a lot more concerned about it, a lot more negative about it. But, this is what the past president campaigned on, right, Bill? I mean, fake news, and he was going after the national media, and it penetrated over that period, his 2 campaigns and his 4 years in the White House. So you see that. And the other thing that I think, and I'll let Bill talk a little bit more about this, but is the fact that social media gets a lot more agreement by both parties and a concern by both Democrats and Republicans.
Right. Well, I think it's important to remember too that the news media has the Federal Communications Commission. There are strict rules about what you can say and not say on television or the radio, for example, how campaign ads are run and what you have to disclose, whereas social media is a bit of a free-for-all. So the good news is that this has become, as people know, this has become a very big issue in Congress. There have been hearings. There's likely to be more. Some of the social media companies are trying to figure out a way to self-govern themselves, but there's clearly going to be a need for some kind of congressional action to set some limits and set some guidelines to make the information, less violent, less hate speech, more responsible, more editorial oversight. Those are all things that hopefully will help address this issue.
I think that's such a good point. As we've seen in some of the congressional hearings on Facebook, and it's not just Facebook, but there's a real concern about what this is doing to democracy. A few years ago, people would complain about cable news networks and how they were either left or right, and they were creating this friction. But, probably more important to delve into the workings of some of these social media companies. I mean, when we find out through the whistleblower that negative comments and thumbs down on Facebook is given 5 times the weight of a like or a thumbs up, you've got something going on there. Right. And so I think this is a healthy development that both Republicans and Democrats are looking into this and really, really concerned about it.
Yeah.
So I'll make just a couple other points about this. I think there was a great quote by a former senator from New York, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who said, we're all entitled to our own opinions, but we're not entitled to our own facts. And what do we see nowadays with that? Well, we see really very strange facts, so-called, going out there. And one of the things that I think this leads to is sort of conspiratorial notions. You go way back to the 1950s and Joe McCarthy and communism, but you also saw during the Obama years, large segments of the population that said he wasn't born in the United States. He was born in the United States. You see large segments of the population that said he was a Muslim. He was not a Muslim. And we're right down the street from where we live here in Washington. There's a place called Comet Ping Pong. And on the QAnon websites and all over was this notion that there was some kind of a child sex ring going on directed by Hillary Clinton. It was absurd. But the scary part was that a fella who was reading all this came up from North Carolina with an AK-47. He was going to shoot up the place. Luckily, he was stopped. So these kinds of, as Bill says, these kind of hate speech situations, or heaven forbid, calling people to violence, it has real life consequences. So that's something very important to think about. We do have some questions, I guess.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add is because of the growth of social media and the technology, and on the other hand, the importance of information, of correct information,
right,
as a basis of democracy. Clearly, this has got to be addressed in a big way by the regulators, because you need editors, you need screening, they're trying to do that, but
right.
It's become too important. Social media has become too important in terms of our information gathering, not to regulate it.
That's right. I think that's a really good point. I also think, to Jen's point earlier, that, and this is another poll, a PBS Marist poll that just came out, and they were asking, who are the sources of misinformation? Do you blame the Democrats or do you blame the Republicans? Well, surprise, surprise, 44% of the Republicans blame the Democrats. 43% of the Democrats blame the Republicans. So, we do have this problem too that we've got to solve. And as you say, correcting what is fact and what is fiction is critical here. I know Jen's answered one.
Jen's got a question or answer.
Yeah, we might have her do it on. Let's see. We can answer in the chat. Okay. All right. Well, that's already done with the chat, so we're people can see that, I gather. So why don't we though go to Jen a little bit here and talk about elections, which was a key part of the survey.
Sure, thank you. Definitely a key part of this survey. We asked specific questions about the election legitimacy. And we saw that elections is really another major area of concern, and that generally people are losing trust in elections in these 5 states. When we asked, thinking about the last several presidential elections in the US, do you think the last several presidential elections have been generally more secure or less secure than those held in the past? We saw that 42% of adults in these 5 states say that the last several presidential elections have generally been less secure than presidential elections held before them. We did see a party divide, as we would probably expect, given the outcome of the election. Republicans are more likely than Democrats to say that they felt like the past several elections have been less secure. So 63% of Republicans say that they feel like the last several elections have been less secure, compared to 17% of Democrats. We also asked individuals about the 2020 presidential election specifically, and if they believe former Vice President Joe Biden legitimately defeated incumbent President Donald Trump in the November 2020 presidential election. And half of adults in the 5 states surveyed believed that Joe Biden did legitimately defeat Donald Trump in the 2020 presidential election. Approximately 2 in 5 adults in the key states tested say that they do not believe that Joe Biden legitimately defeated Donald Trump in 2020. We, of course, see differences by party ID. Only about 1/4 of Republicans in the 5 states surveyed believe that believe in the legitimacy of the election, while 81% of Democrats say that they believe in the legitimacy of the election. So we wanted to know why. We asked, to what extent do you believe each of the following happened in the November 2020 presidential election? Do you think people voted illegally? Do you think the election was rigged? Do you think there was voter suppression? People were discouraged or prevented from voting? Do you believe that there was foreign interference in the election? And around half of adults in all of these 5 states tested believe that these things happened. They think that people voted illegally. They think that people were probably discouraged from voting, or that there was foreign interference. And when we break out these responses by party ID, we see some interesting differences. Half or more Republicans see each of the options tested as an issue in election legitimacy, especially people voting illegally and election rigging. On the other hand, Democrats really only see voter suppression as an issue in election legitimacy. Maybe some foreign interference as well, but I think that voter suppression piece was really concerning for Democrats in these 5 states. We also asked about post-election events at the Capitol. We started with a general question just about the place of political violence in democracy generally. Adults in these 5 states had the opportunity to choose between 2 options based on which one came closer to their opinion. So they chose between political violence is not justified in a democracy, the better solution is the ballot box, or political violence is justified in a democracy when you believe things have gotten so bad that the government is not acting in the best interests of the people. And of course, we gave an opt-out, so an opportunity for someone to say that they don't know. And there is a segment of adults in each of these 5 states who feel like political violence is sometimes justified. In some instances, it's okay. But half or more of adults in each of these 5 states tested say that they do not believe political violence is justified. There is a slight split by party ID. About 25% of Republicans compared to 13% of Democrats say that they believe that political violence, is justified in some cases. And then we followed up with a question specifically about violence at the Capitol on January 6th. We asked, generally, do you believe that those actions were justified? Those actions of those involved, were they justified or were they not? And half or more adults in each of the states tested, with the exception of Wyoming, which is just slightly under half, say that they definitely do not think that the actions at the Capitol were justified. Approximately 15% say that they do believe that these actions were justified. Again, we saw a slight split by party ID. 24% of Republicans surveyed in these 5 states, compared to 10% of Democrats, say that they believe that these actions were probably or definitely justified. And then finally, in this section, we asked who was responsible for that violence. And a little over 1/3, 38% of voters felt like former President Donald Trump was most responsible when they were allowed to select up to 2 options from the list that we provided here. Around 20% say far-right activists, 15% say media. But as you would expect, there's definitely some partisanship happening here. It's really the fact that people are saying former President Donald Trump is most responsible is really being driven by Democrats in these states. 79% of Democrats say that Donald Trump was most responsible, compared to just 13% of Republicans. I'm going to open the floor up again for discussion before we move on to our 2 final sections, finding common ground, and then finishing off with a section about strengthening democracy.
Thanks, Jen. There's a lot in this section for sure to discuss and for folks out there to ask questions about. And one of the things I think that is crystal clear here is once you get below the overall numbers, you really see a split between the views of Republicans and Democrats. You also see a bit of a split with the legitimacy of the Biden election in rural areas where they're less likely to accept the Biden victory. And this is somewhat natural because the tendency lately, as most of you know, is for rural areas to be more Republican than ever before. But I think one of the things that's a little scary about all this is as much as the media and most responsible people come out, Republicans and Democrats, saying that the election was legitimate, that yes, Joe Biden won. It was 7 million votes. It was close in some states, but there wasn't any fraud. There wasn't any rigging. There wasn't any 69 lawsuits dismissed. But the fact that this was a steady drumbeat, not only after the election took place, but before, it creates real problems. And once you sow this notion that these elections are legitimate, you really set yourself up for real danger. One other poll that I will cite is that CNN poll showed that just over half, 51% of Americans now believe that an election in the next few years will be overturned by elected officials because their party lost. Now that begins to get very scary. And, normal ways of doing things are thrown out the window. Regular order is thrown out the window. And despite whoever happens to believe that, to a certain extent, Democrats were very concerned, although they didn't rise to much of a level. But when Al Gore ended up losing because of Florida, there were questions about that election too. But, once the election is decided, you don't storm the Capitol. Right.
And I think, part of this is, if you look at some of these responses, part of this is we have to get back to basics. We have to get back to the fact that when people win elections, they're respected. And if we want to try to think about building confidence, the local and state level, maybe that's where you have to start, building confidence that the results are correct, that people, like in Virginia, the recent governor's race, Terry McAuliffe conceded that night. People were able to move on. The other thing is the whole process, the election process. For example, in Oregon and Utah, they have mail-in ballots. I think that would be one way of strengthening the confidence in elections, so people aren't worried about illegitimate voters or that there's some kind of problem with the electoral system. So this is all pointing us to the need to increase confidence in the system and trying to figure out where we can do that. But that would be one way of doing it.
Yeah, I think this is critical, because if we don't have systems in place that people feel confidence in, we're going to see more chaos. And to one of the questions in the chat from Chase and Kevin, the one of the questions is, with this chaos, how does the business community respond? And then, if they're concerned about the chaos, as one of the questions was, why are they still contributing to candidates?
Right.
So,
well, I would say generally business likes predictability so they can plan. They want stable governments. They want stable federal and state budgets, et cetera. Now, that doesn't mean that individual companies are going to lobby and promote their own interests. If it's a pharmaceutical company, that's trying to stop Medicare from negotiating with pharmaceutical companies, or steel companies that want tariffs internationally. I mean, but I would say generally that's true, that people want, orderly government. They want orderly transfer of power. And it's not just the business community, by the way. It's our allies. It's internationally.
Right.
The world wants to see the United States as a stable democracy, rule of law, where the transition of government is stable. And one of the worst things that happened in this last transition is that the world started saying, wait a minute, is this a banana republic, or is this a source of stability and a beacon of democracy?
And I think that, it's like we weren't the only ones that were watching January 6th on television and unfold the violence. They were watching it all over the world.
Absolutely.
And so you've got a situation there, which is pretty scary. I will also say that it's very interesting, because even though you look at the overall poll and you say, gee, most people don't want violence, most people, are against it. But the very fact that you have 20%, 1 in 5 Americans thinking that that's all right, that 1 out of 4 Republicans. And then something else in looking at that poll, I don't know whether Jen can put up the slide again, and she mentioned it, but it's showing that 22%, I believe, of people don't know or are unsure. Yes, there's the slide. So, and I won't ask, this is unfair to Jen to ask this, so I'll just say it. The fact that it's 22% is a very, very high number. What? You're not sure whether violence is appropriate? You're not sure that you favor the ballot box? The unsure there strikes me as quite a high number. And what is scary to me is, we always talk about people that sometimes, are in an area where they can be moved, right? And it's something for us to think very seriously about. Is do these people think by becoming patriots and storming they call themselves patriots and storming the Capitol, that therefore violence is okay? Do they have a sense of it? And we're seeing incidents, personal incidents in the Congress, where folks are attacking one another. And this is not like when Frank Church was in the United States Senate when we both worked there. Right. You would no more make comments or put up videos or pictures of people the way it's being done now. That just did not happen. There, you had folks, even though they disagreed, they ideologically they were very different, they were civil. They talk to one another. They find areas where they can work together on legislation, even if they've found areas where they couldn't. And the notion that the things were so bad that you had to take up arms, wasn't even on the radar screen. So I just make that comment about that 22% because it kind of scares me, to be perfectly honest.
Go ahead, Jen. Sorry.
Yeah, Jen.
I was going to say one more point to help fuel the conversation. We do have a data point from this poll that we didn't include in this summary that says that 59% of adults in these key states believe that violence like what happened at the Capitol after the last election is likely to happen again in the future. So just thinking about that permission piece, I think it's something that is really on the minds of adults in these 5 states even now.
Thank you.
I would just make 2 comments. First of all, if you're in private business or you work for university or anything else, if you made these kind of comments about being promoting violence, you probably get fired the next day in terms of civil dialogue. Right. And the other thing is, if you're going to address the issue of getting people away from violence, I think the only way to address it is to give people more faith in the electoral system, make sure they see government working effectively, like infrastructure, where things are done to improve the schools, improve the broadband, and rebuild the bridges. That's probably the best solution, because you're not going to, people that are saying they believe things have gotten so bad they're going to go to violence, you're not going to convince them unless you can prove to them the government's effective.
Right. I think that's a critical point. That's really important. We might want to go to the last section, and then we can sort of bring up some of the things that we've also talked about and take more questions from folks in the audience.
Sure. Thank you for passing it back over. So moving on to our final couple of sections, the first one is finding common ground as another area of concern, and then we'll finish it off talking about how to strengthen democracy. So this final area explored communication. We asked, generally, do you believe that Americans of different political viewpoints have an easy time or a difficult time talking to one another about politics? And adults really acknowledge that Americans do have a hard time talking with each other when they have political viewpoints that are different. About 80% say that it's something that's difficult for people. Going into a little bit more detail, we ask, how often would you say that American adults do each of the following? Listen to people with the same political views, listen to people with different political views, find common ground on political views, shift your own opinion or shift someone else's opinion. And while adults in these states believe that Americans listen to people with the same political view pretty well, it looks like 74% say that this happens often or sometimes. Americans are much less likely to believe that other Americans listen to people with different political views, find common ground on political views, or shift their own or someone else's opinion. But we see that adults, Americans in these 5 states, are holding their elected officials to a higher standard. They want elected officials to find common ground. We ask, thinking about what you want out of an elected official, which of these 2 attributes are more important to you? Is it more important to you that an elected official finds compromise and common ground between political parties, or is it more important that an elected official stands their ground and they really push their own party's political agenda? And most adults, and that's across all 5 states, the aggregate and individual states, want to see compromise. Only 17% say that they want their elected officials to stand their ground, compared to 66% who say that they want to see that compromise. And then just moving on to a couple more things that adults in these 5 states want to see that they think could help strengthen democracy besides compromise are these solutions that we have listed here. We know that adults in these key states are concerned about the health of democracy, including some of the core elements that we talked about today, like representation, elections, communication, media, and misinformation. But adults in these states also have really clear views about how to help strengthen democracy. We asked adults from the following options, what do you believe, if anything, would help strengthen democracy in the US? And they could select as many as they wanted. This was a long list of options, but I only included anything that was got above 25% selection, just to keep us focused on what people think would really make the biggest difference. And the top responses focused definitely on structural reforms, like holding politicians accountable for illegal or unethical behavior, reducing the amount of money in politics, holding elected officials accountable for campaign promises, regulating the spread of misinformation. But also, respondents identified more grassroots solutions as effective options to help strengthen democracy, like those that are highlighted here, adding more civics education in school, and also encouraging conversations between individuals with different political views. So there are a variety of options in the eyes of Americans in these 5 states to help repair democracy, some at the structural level and some at the grassroots level. So I'll just turn it back over to the other panelists to get their perspective on the effectiveness of these solutions.
Thanks, Jen. This whole area, I think, is it comes to the very heart of what we're trying to do at the Frank Church Institute and other institutes are trying to do, and what many people around the country are talking about. That is, how do you break out of the polarization and the mistrust that people have for one another. And one of the things I think that Jen points up, so clearly here is that voters really are, or even non-voters, people out there are 4 times as likely to search for common ground rather than stand your ground, and that's a big number. I think, given the disparity of feelings that we've seen in this poll, and the concern about alienation and being separated from your government, and then how do you take that basic sense of cooperation and turn it into to specifics?
Yeah, exactly. And it's interesting when you look at the graph that talks about 66% of find common ground, want their elected officials to find common ground. 63% in a recent poll of the American public supported the infrastructure bill, because it's about, not to bang on about the infrastructure bill, but it's an example that there is public support for solutions to the country's problems.
Yep. So one of the things that we want to talk about in the future, I think, and involve people in, is an open dialogue series of focus groups and meetings. The School of Public Affairs, Public Policy is pursuing that. And, sometimes you start small. I mean, you start, as Bill says, you go local, and you begin to see where people can come together on issues that they can agree on, not go crazy on issues that they disagree on. We'll get to that. But the situation now is, I think, grave enough. And again, other polls show this. CNN has 56% of Americans saying that democracy is under attack, and 37% more that it's being tested. I mean, it's like our numbers. You get 90% of the people who are legitimately worried about this, who are really care a great deal about it. And for that matter, right now, and this may be by partly the party in power, but you have more Republicans than Democrats really worried in this way.
Yeah.
And so the question is, how best to pull those people together. And and interrupt me because I can go on and on, as you know, Bill. It used to be what divided people. It used to be religion divided people. I mean, 1960, could you elect a Catholic as president of the United States? People, our parents or grandparents, the big worry was when their kids were dating, what religion was the other person? Right. If you're a Catholic, could you marry someone who's Jewish? I mean, there was like, whoa. Now, if the real question seems to be for a lot of people, I can't, I'm a Democrat. I can't marry somebody who's a Republican or go with them. Well, our politics in some respects have become our personalities. And that's not the way America has always been. And one of the things I think that we have to really look very seriously at, and this is, I think people in rural areas sometimes get this better than people in cities. When you have a water break, a pipe, they don't ask you whether you're a Democrat or Republican. They come help fix your water pipe. When you're stuck on the side of the road and you got a problem, folks will help you.
Yeah.
And we saw this, we had, when Bethany Church went back to Idaho to join her friends and to live after Frank Church died, Allison, my wife, and I, and 2 kids, bought the little teeny log cabin they had in Pennsylvania, rural log cabin next to a creek. Bill's been there. And, when somebody smashed some windows in that cabin, a guy who ran a hardware store, a friend of ours, came by. he repaired everything. I mean, he knew how to do this. And I said, well, how much do I owe you? He wouldn't take any money. He wouldn't even think about it. It was an insult. It would have been an insult to give him money. I'm not saying that this solves all the problems, but we have to look at each other as people. I mean, when I used to debate strong Republicans and conservatives, we'd sit in the green room and beforehand, and we'd joke and we'd talk about how do you solve some of these problems? How do you handle it?
Yeah. I would. So I think that the encouraging news in all this is that there is a 40% level of people that want to listen to other people with different political views and find common ground. And I think if you think about something like, other areas where people might be able to cooperate across party lines. I mean, global warming comes to mind. If you look at the floods just today in the Northwest, the fires in California, the droughts in the mountain states, these are areas where people are going to have to work together. Farmers, rural people, urban people are going to have to work together to find solutions. So part of the dialogue, back to local issues and building confidence and dialogue on local issues, if it's global warming or infrastructure or the school system, where maybe people aren't yelling at each other at board meetings, but talking about, the quality of the education and after school activities, whatever it is. So we've got to find ways to build that civic engagement and build trust across party lines and in areas that fix problems like global warming, for example.
Right. And I think that's right, Bill. And I also think that what we've done, we're into soundbite politics. Years ago, the average soundbite on the evening news was 38 seconds. It went down to 8 seconds. I think it's like 4 seconds now. Everybody's into a soundbite or into a hot button issue, which they're going to drive home. And once you start on that path, it makes it harder and harder to cooperate. I'll tell another story which fits into this. The interesting thing to me is that even though the poll shows people aren't they don't have a tendency to support just the party line. Most people, especially in Washington, that's all they do is they go down the party line. Right. And one of the things that I was at a bipartisan policy conference a number of years ago, and we were going to an event, and there was a discussion of a number of issues. And I sat next on the bus to Trent Lott. And Trent Lott had been the Republican leader of the United States Senate. He worked with Tom Daschle, the Democratic leader, on a lot of things. He's a very conservative guy. And at the time, one of the big issues was the pledge that Republicans were supposed to sign never to raise taxes. Now, and I was curious. I wasn't sure the answer I was going to get. But I was sitting next to Trent Lott, and I said, Senator, I'm really curious. What do you think of this proposal that Republicans sign this pledge? And he said, Peter, I don't do any of that. I don't play it. And the litmus test is not my game. And he said, you get yourself in more trouble when you do things like that, because, you're under pressure. The party's pushing you. Folks are telling you, in order to be a good stalwart party person, you gotta go with that. And it was a very interesting conversation because, what you've got now is folks that are really afraid. And I say this on both sides sometimes. There's a little more division and consternation in the Democratic Party lately, but there's a lot of just voting the same. If as you were told by the party, and voters clearly on this poll don't particularly like that. But the interesting thing to me is that if we can get into a situation, not unlike what existed when we worked in the Senate, when you had people from different areas of the country. You had Southern conservative Democrats that would often vote with Republicans. You had Northern Republicans who were moderates or liberals that would definitely vote the other way. You had people like Mitch McConnell, supporting civil rights legislation, along with Everett Dirksen. He wasn't in the Senate then, McConnell, but he was working in the Senate. And you had Everett Dirksen, who pretty much delivered the votes for Lyndon Johnson on the civil rights bills in 1964 and 1965. And people weren't afraid to say also, hey, I changed my mind. I saw new facts. Right. Things were different. Folks who 20 years ago wanted to deny that global warming existed, that there was climate change, that folks have come around. But it's hard for some of these people to say, I wasn't, I'm changing my mind. There's nothing wrong with changing your mind. And in order for the system to work, people have to be open to those kinds of new ideas, new facts, new approaches, and to seriously get stuff done.
Yeah. There's some glimmers of hope in the Congress. There are people that the Problem Solvers Caucus, for example, there is some bipartisan outreach on some issues, but it's so alienated here in Washington that I think the best way to try to address these issues is at the local and state level and build confidence there, because trying to fix it here is not real.
It's hard.
Not realistic.
Clearly, to your point, and even though there's consternation among some Republicans of those 13 that voted for the infrastructure bill, it was a bipartisan bill. It passed with 67 votes in the United States Senate. McConnell voted for it. A lot of Republicans supported the infrastructure bill because they knew how important it was to local communities. And, I kind of wonder when things get going, whether people say, that new bridge that we have, and I think maybe that was a good idea. If they change their position on it, I'll be happy. I must say, I think the other thing that we've talked about here, and this is where universities and colleges and institutes like Frank Church Institute or the Dole Institute, that I'm also on the board, play a role. We need, on the local level, as Bill says, and at the university level, we need more attention paid to civil dialogue, to how the system does operate, to if there are problems in the system, how do we fix them? And one of the things in this poll that surprised me, and we'll get more into this in the future, is, and I wouldn't have predicted this, the Democrats have always been the ones, over the years, who have talked about campaign finance reform. Well, I'll tell you, you look at these numbers, and there's some national polling too on this. People are really concerned about money in politics. It has gone from in 2016, we spent in the presidential campaigns, the Senate campaigns, and the House campaigns, the federal campaigns, we spent about $7.5 billion in our campaigns. That's a lot of money. We went this last time, it was doubled. It was over $14 billion spent in campaigns. And that to people is concerning. And again, across the world, Bill, you lived all over the place. In London, are you kidding me? A race for parliament. First of all, it lasts 6 weeks or something. Yeah. But you don't spend. The people are very cynical of other countries about what we're doing here. Yeah. Is it improving democracy, or is it undermining democracy?
Well, it's undermining democracy, and that's why people are concerned about it. And it's the second on the question of one of Jen's polls, where it says list of options. How do you strengthen democracy in the U.S.? Reduce the amount of money in politics was this 52% was people are, as you say, very concerned about it. The next one's holding people accountable, but it's definitely destroyed. It's undermining democracy, where we should be talking about the differences in policies and what party can give you a better policy on, taxes or global warming or childcare. That should be the discussion. It shouldn't be these extreme positions people are taking.
Right. And I think we've changed a bit too. And it's up to legislators, and it's up to office holders to, as Bill says, to focus on what's really important. And, we've gotten into the press release game where we send out these press releases and in order to score a political point. And look, it isn't all about winning an election. It's about making real progress. And yeah, as Jen put it up the screen there, and it's interesting to me because if you look at a couple of these, and we put them in, especially because of this, going after people for illegal or unethical behavior, in a way, that's a gimme, right? I mean, everybody kind of agrees with that. Or holding elected officials accountable for campaign promises. Those are things that, that should be normal. That should be a gimme. And the other stuff is a little trickier. And when you go down that list, you really do see interesting points of things that need to be changed, both on the, I won't call it cosmic, but both on the overall government level, the big picture level, stuff more from Washington, and as Bill says, things that you can do locally. And Jen, did you have a comment about that slide a little bit?
No, I'm just leaning in to listen.
Just soaking it in there.
Yeah,
that's good. So, I don't know, Bill, you have a few other things?
Well, no, the only other lesson in terms of addressing problems is if you see what's going on right now, where people are concerned about inflation, the supply chain, all these things that affect American families and the kind of the kitchen table economic issues. And that's what government's got to address. Government's got to address making people's lives better, whether it's childcare or inflation or safety and whatever it is. And when we get off into these extremes is when so it's all about getting back to basics, rebuilding confidence in the electoral system, in the functioning of government. And this recent discussion by New Hampshire, by Sununu, the governor of Sununu, who's trying to be a governor, solving problems. He's like, the Republican senatorial committee was trying to get him to run for Senate from New Hampshire. And he's like, no, I'm not going to go down to that cesspool. I'm going to stay in New Hampshire, be an effective government and solve people's problems. So I think you got to build it from the bottom. And that's, where hopefully partly what we'll focus on in the future.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I think one of the things that we see increasingly is that this is the business of losing touch a bit. And this was quite a while ago, but I gave a talk one day to the Democratic caucus in the House. And I came in with a series of questions. And the first question was asking people what percentage of Americans had a specialty coffee drink, a latte, whatever, a Starbucks type cup of coffee. And this is like 20 years ago. So, but I said, well, is it 75% or more? And a bunch of hands go up. 50%, a lot more hands go up. 25%, practically everybody's hands go up. Well, the actual answer was something like 7% of Americans. Who's paying $4 for a cup of coffee? Well, some people are, we are maybe. But let me tell you, back then especially, it was a scary thing to me. And then I asked how many folks had graduated from four-year college and how many, a whole series of questions. But the basic point was that a lot of these folks were kind of out of touch, right? I mean, they were living in their own bubbles. And that's increased. I mean, we're living in our own bubbles. You can tell by someone's zip code practically how they're going to vote nowadays. But the members of Congress, members of state legislatures have got to listen to the folks on the ground. And it's pocketbook issues, as Bill said. I mean, you guys are fighting about all this other stuff. Why not talk about what really matters to me? And tell me what you're planning to do about it. And, I think one of the things that there are a lot of groups that are thinking about this and working the problem, but it's like that scene, which I love, from Apollo 13, where the the actor.
Tom,
it wasn't Tom Hanks though. It was the it was the guy that. I'm going to blow this. I don't want to blow it. I don't want to give Apollo 13 is such a great show. But anyway, the basic point with Ed Harris, who's playing Gene Kranz, who was the head of the NASA. Houston, we have a problem. Well, he said, stop fighting, stop arguing. Don't look for the easy stuff. Fix the problem. Fix the problem. And that's all the American people are asking for. Fix the problem. And we have the capacity to do that. We've done it in the past. We can do it again. But it seems to me that we're in a situation now where the distrust and the mistrust is so strong that it does really make it hard. And it's up to it's up to the people to pull back from violence, to pull back from the hatred, to see what brings them together. There's a group it's trying to do a piece which is called My Hometown. You can look it up on YouTube. It started with Colin Powell, and he's talked about growing up in Brooklyn, what his hometown meant to him, and what kinds of things people did for one another, and it was this notion that we have a lot more that unites us than divides us, and that we have to focus more on that than focusing on why we're angry with one another. So, plus the fact, I think that we tend, and we all get into this, and Bill and I do. You get kind of self-righteous about your stuff. You kind of get, everything you're certain about this, certain about that. I have the facts. I know this. And, wrong. The inflexibility and the inability to as our friend John Tester quotes his mother all the time, I got two ears and one mouth. I think I'll try to listen twice as much as I talk. And that, it makes sense. But
there's also some issues that the American public agree on. For example, pre-K for 3 and 4 year olds. There's a majority of the country is for that. It's important for underprivileged. It's important for making us competitive in the 21st century.
Right.
And there's things like that really helps women come back into the workforce after the pandemic. There are things like that we should focus on and agree to that really improve the quality of life for people and will make a big difference in the future.
Right. And that's also the importance of education in our country.
Right.
And, from the very establishment of America, people focused on that. And, we have to do a much better job pushing that on both parties. We don't need to argue, to be honest, about same-sex bathrooms. I don't think. I'm going to get some blowback on that, but
and also compared to other industrial, compared to other on the issue of pre-K, compared to other industrial companies, we're now at the bottom of the list. Also for personal leave and health leave and all that stuff. But those are things. Pre-K is something that I think people generally agree on, that it addresses a bunch of issues. Those are the kinds of things we can rally around that are, and reach across the aisle and get done. So those are
right. I think one of the things that I'll never forget it, and Bill hasn't forgotten it either, and the other folks that worked for Frank Church for so long. One of the first questions that he asked all of us when we were working on legislation is, who do you have from the other side? What group of Republicans do you have that want to support this? Who should I talk to about it? And, he also said, look, do I want the whole loaf? When I'm putting in a bill, do I want it exactly the way I want it? Well, of course I do. But will I take 60% of the loaf if I have to get it passed? Sure. Then I'll go back and see if I can get the other 40%.
Right.
And that attitude, which is so critical to issues that Bill is talking about, issues like education, like universal pre-K, like prescription drugs. I mean, we've known forever that the cost of prescription drugs is just horrendous for a lot of people, and we got to figure out a way to make this work. And this is not, as my old partner says, this isn't brain surgery, but of course, brain surgeons don't do it.
It's I mean, in most advanced countries, the Medicare system or the federal medical system negotiates the prices with pharmaceutical companies,
right.
Except here.
Right.
And that's why we have the highest pharmaceutical. So there are issues like that people can find compromise on and build trust. I think it's about getting back to basics, building trust, strengthening the election system, strengthening the local and state kind of cooperation on local issues, and then getting that somehow over time to the federal level.
Right. And I think one of the things that we have learned over the last few decades is that sometimes things have to get to what is perceived as a crisis point, right? In other words, that people get nervous and scared enough, and then they're willing to act and willing to move forward. And we said at the beginning, I think, democracy in a sense is a little bit on life support right now. And it's the times when people have looked to government to help solve problems are times like the Great Depression, or even the Great Recession after 2008, or even 9/11.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, when 9/11 hit, the country united. There is no question about it. And I'm not Pollyannish enough to see that coming immediately. But I think that we've got hope in this poll, because we can see where people are going, mm-hmm. and we can see the kinds of things that they believe we can do. And now we have to explore just how to get them done. I don't know, Jen, whether you have anything that you'd like to say, or closing comments, or Gary, but you're good. Great.
All good. Yeah. Thank you.
I think we've got the questions, most of them answered here. Let me just go through. We have in the chat various questions and make sure we've covered most of them here. Yeah, I think we're good. So I may turn it back to Gary to sort of close us out a little bit. We're a few minutes early, and of course we could talk forever, but we won't.
So our thanks to the morning panelists, Peter, Fenn, Bill Fish, and Jen Macdonald, for a very thoughtful discussion of these vital issues. After a break, please join us for the conference keynote speaker, Celinda Lake, at 11 a.m. Mountain Time. Thank you.